There are plenty of choices in today's popular SUV segment. Here are our picks from the wide range of models available now. In this video, we will talk about top 20 best SUVs of 2024. These SUVs were selected based on rankings such as Subcompact, Subcompact Luxury, Compact, Compact Performance. The video about them includes fuel consumption, starting price, CD rating score, and other information. Buick ENVISTA, Buick's latest offering. The 2024 ENVISTA is set to take on subcompact SUV competitors with a sleek, coupe-like design and value-oriented pricing. One of the best subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 28 mpg city, 32 mpg highway. Starting price $23,495. CD rating, score 9/10. Chevrolet Trax. The 2024 Chevy Trax returns as a larger crossover with an affordable starting price and a strong offering of standard safety features. One of the best subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 28 mpg city, 32 mpg highway. Starting price $21,495. CD rating, score 10/10. Hyundai KONA. The all-new 2024 Hyundai KONA wears cool retro future styling, features upgraded cabin tech, and is larger than before, but it's still a spunky subcompact crossover with a high value quotient. One of the best subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 29 mpg city, 34 mpg highway. Starting price $25,625. CD rating, score 8/5/10. KIA NIRO. With a bold look, the 2024 Kia NIRO adds a dose of cool to its eco-friendly image, but its real-world fuel economy was a disappointment in our testing. One of the best subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 53 mpg city, 54 mpg highway. Starting price $28,315. CD rating, score 8/5/10. Mazda CX-5. The 2024 Mazda CX-5 is a longtime favorite and comes highly recommended, but it might be time to think up a new award-winning formula to keep up with the rest. One of the best compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 24 mpg city, 30 mpg highway. Starting price $30,675. CD rating, score 9/10. Subaru CROSSTREK. While it's merely a car masquerading as an SUV, the 2024 Subaru CROSSTREK manages to offer a semblance of off-road capability alongside its rugged styling. One of the best subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 28 mpg city, 34 mpg highway. Starting price $26,540. CD rating, score 8/5/10. Volkswagen TAOS. With room for both people and cargo, as well as some solid fuel efficiency, the Volkswagen TAOS makes the most of its small stature. One of the best subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 28 mpg city, 36 mpg highway. Starting price $25,420. CD rating, score 8/5/10. BMW X1. BMW's entry-level SUV, the X1, has been a favorite of ours for some time, thanks to its agile handling, eager nature, and practical shape. One of the best luxury subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 25 mpg city, 34 mpg highway. Starting price $41,495. CD rating, score 9/10. Volvo XC40. The 2024 Volvo XC40 delivers huge practicality, a premium cabin, nice standard tech, and Volvo's reputation for safety, all in a lively Swedish design. one of the best luxury subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 23 mpg city, 30 mpg highway. Starting price $41,795. CD rating score 9, 5/10. Ford Bronco Sport with similar styling cues and legit off-road chops. The Ford Bronco Sport gives people a taste of the bigger Bronco in a more accessible way. One of the best compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 25 mpg city, 28 mpg highway. Starting price $32,825. CD rating scored 9/10. Honda CR-V. The 2024 Honda CR-V, with an excellent chassis and an efficient hybrid option, is a star in the compact crossover segment. One of the best compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 28 mpg city, 34 mpg highway. Starting price $30,850. CD rating score 10/10. Mazda CX-30, handsomely styled and surprisingly fun to drive. The 2024 Mazda CX-30 is one of our favorites and is the small SUV to buy for those with good taste. One of the best subcompact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 26 mpg city, 33 mpg highway. Starting price $26,370. CD rating score 9, 5/10. Mazda CX-50. The 2024 CX-50 brings refinement and driving joy to the compact SUV class in a way that only a Mazda can, and delivers it wrapped in a handsomely designed package. One of the best compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 24 mpg city, 30 mpg highway. Starting price $31,675. CD rating score 9, 5/10. Volkswagen Tiguan. The Tiguan blends spirited handling, sharp, subtle style, and an available third row to bring European charm to the competitive compact SUV class. One of the best compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 24 mpg city, 31 mpg highway. Starting price $30,305. CD rating scored 9/10. BMW X3. The 2024 BMW X3 SUV edges in on the 3 Series sports sedans territory with a satisfying blend of refinement and driver engagement. One of the best luxury compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 29 mpg city, 31 mpg highway. Starting price $47,895. CD rating scored 9/10. Genesis GV70. Genesis's unique take on luxury is evident in each of its offerings, particularly so in the 2024 GV70 SUV, which mixes style and substance in a beautiful way. One of the best luxury compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 22 mpg city, 28 mpg highway. Starting price $46,500. CD rating scored 10/10. Mercedes-Benz GLC-CLASS. The 2024 GLC-CLASS takes everything we like about the Mercedes-Benz C-Class sedan, including posh digs and high-tech features, and wraps it in an SUV body. One of the best luxury compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 24 mpg city, 32 mpg highway. Starting price $48,600. CD rating scored 9/10. Porsche Macan. Most SUVs can't get out of their own way on curvy roads, but where the 2024 Porsche Macan is concerned, zigzagging is playtime, and good luck catching up. One of the best luxury compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 19 mpg city, 25 mpg highway. Starting price $62,500. CD rating scored 10/10. Volvo XC60. Volvo blends its unique take on luxury with agreeable engine options and a serene cabin experience in the 2024 XC60 SUV, one of the best luxury compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 23 mpg city, 29 mpg highway. Starting price $48,195. CD rating scored 9/10. Alfa Romeo Stelvio Quadrifoglio. The 2024 Alfa Romeo Stelvio Quadrifoglio takes everything you hate about crossovers and replaces it with 505 horsepower and supreme driving characteristics. One of the best performance compact SUVs of 2024. Fuel consumption is 17 mpg city, 23 mpg highway. Starting price $94,965. CD rating scored 9/10. Like this, we have come to the end of the video about the best SUVs of 2024. If you made it this far, I'm sure the video was useful for you. In return, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. See you in the new videos. Take care of yourself.